year-over-year average hourly earnings, which were expected to rise by 4.6, and which would have been a slight reduction from the up 4.7 from the prior month. Instead, we revised the prior month to up 4.9, and November, instead of going down, it rose to up 5.1%. So a big increase in average hourly earnings both on the month and year over year, and that sent a chill through the market that the Fed would now have to be tighter with its monetary policy because inflation was getting worse due to increased pressure from rising wages. Now, average hours worked actually declined a bit from 34.5 to 34.4, but still, workers got paid more for every hour that they did work, and that, of course, adds to the upward pressure on costs that their employers are already having to deal with. But in reality, it's not rising wages that are going to cause higher inflation. It is higher inflation that is causing wages to rise. Wages are just a price, the price of labor, just like every other price, and prices are going up because of inflation. And what this jobs report indicates is higher inflation. Inflation is pushing up wages. Now, they're not going up as much as prices because prices are still up about 8% year over year, and that's the official increase. The actual increase is probably twice that amount. And so real earnings are collapsing. And that is the real story behind this payrolls number, because contrary to the way it's being described by the media, it is not a strong report. In fact, I read one news story that described the U.S. labor market as being hot. Because of this report, we had a red-hot labor market, according to the media. Well, the labor market is not hot, it's actually cool. In fact, it's pretty much ice cold, and that's what the non-farm payroll report actually reveals if you're smart enough to look beneath the surface. And by the way, you don't have to look very deep. Just looking at the nature of the jobs that were created, they were almost all service sector jobs. Only 14,000 manufacturing jobs were added. That's well below the 20,000 that were expected, and even more below the 36,000 that were added in the prior month. Remember, the problem with these service sector jobs, and a lot of them were in government, they were in healthcare, they were in leisure and hospitality, but these jobs don't produce goods. But the people who have these jobs buy goods. Well, if they're buying goods that they didn't help produce, where are these goods coming from? They're going to come from abroad. These jobs that are being added are simply going to add to the trade deficit as people who have non-productive service sector jobs take their paychecks and buy goods that they didn't help produce. And not only do these jobs put upward pressure on the trade deficit, they also put upward pressure on goods prices because you have more people with paychecks to buy goods, but you don't have more people working to produce those goods. So you don't get the increase in supply, but you do get the increase in demand. So not only did this jobs report indicate higher inflation, but it portends even higher inflation in the future. One of the things Biden was bragging about during his speech was all of these manufacturing jobs that have been created since he became president. I don't think any manufacturing jobs have been created since Biden became president. What happened was manufacturing workers who were temporarily laid off before Biden was president were recalled to their jobs after Biden became president. So all these workers didn't get new jobs. They returned to the jobs that they already had before Biden was president. Obviously, if we lock down the country due to COVID and all these companies that were manufacturing had to shut down their plants and furlough their workers, when the economy reopens and those temporarily laid off workers are recalled to the jobs they already had, you can't claim credit for creating manufacturing jobs. But that is exactly what Joe Biden is doing. In fact, if you look at the jobs report from last week, hardly any of the jobs that were created were manufacturing jobs. Manufacturing isn't back at all. In fact, that's why if you look at the last merchandise trade figures, our exports went down because we're manufacturing fewer products that we can export. In fact, Biden himself pointed out that America invented the semiconductor, that we used to be the world's biggest maker of these chips. But now, for some bizarre reason, we're only producing 10% of the world's semiconductors. Manufacturing didn't just leave the United States. The U.S. government chased it out. It was high taxes and excessive regulation that made U.S. manufacturing globally uncompetitive. And so in order to survive, companies had no choice but to move their production offshore. That's what government did. And the way to reverse this process is not to introduce government subsidies, which is what we have now. You have the government now subsidizing an industry that it helped cripple. That's not the way to bring it back. All you're going to do by giving government subsidies to non-competitive sectors is to make sure they never become competitive, because now they rely on the government subsidy. But who covers the cost of that subsidy? It's the American people. They have to pay for it either through higher taxes or through higher inflation. What would be much better if we lowered taxes and repealed regulations so those industries can come back on their own, so they can be competitive again and not a burden on society, but be a benefit to society. In fact, one of the things that Biden praised during his speech was labor unions. Well, labor unions are one of the reasons that so many American manufacturers became uncompetitive. It wasn't just high taxes and excessive regulation. It was excessively high labor costs that were a direct result of labor unions that forced companies to pay workers far in excess of their actual productivity. There were so many rules and requirements that labor unions imposed on American employers that they rendered those employers unproductive. But again, the real reason that those manufacturing jobs made so much money was not because of the labor unions. It was because of the high productivity associated with those jobs, because the employers provided their workers with tools that made those workers much more productive and enabled them to earn more money. It's just that the labor unions tried to force employers to, and they took good, high-paying jobs and made them too costly for the employers. As a result, many of those employers went out of business because they were no longer globally competitive, and many that remained in business outsourced their manufacturing to other countries where they weren't being extorted by labor unions and they weren't burdened by high taxation and excessive regulation.